All right. So I think we're going into the home stretch here, but it always surprises me when I start giving examples. So we'll see how this goes. Eidetic imagery is sort of the formal scientific term for what a lot of lay people call photographic memory. Photographic memory is a little bit of a misleading phrase because it implies that a person has an exact photograph of things that are out in the world, and they probably don't. It's really more of an ability to access and really review images that a person has created in response to external stimuli. This picture is here because our textbook tells us a story about a case who looked at this picture and then later was able to accurately report how many stripes were on the cat's back. And unless they sat there and purposely counted them while looking at the picture, which the child said that they hadn't done, they are somehow reflecting on this picture while it's in their mind. And it's in a very accurate state while it's in their mind. This is a super rare phenomenon. Like most of us do not have it. I have to say though, most of us had it when we were little. But as we got older, we lost whatever skill we had because we started to substitute language for our memory store instead of exact images of the world. So one hypothesis is that we were all eidetic imagers when we were little. And then as we started to learn the language, so somewhere around 2, 3 years old, we start to lose our eidetic imagery capabilities and we substitute language. We don't call it eidetic imagery if a person has really good mnemonic strategies or really careful rehearsal strategies that will help to encode information into their memories. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about a person who holds an image in their mind and can reflect on that image, and that image is very accurate. That's the key thing. Like we all may have, like later in an hour, if I asked you what was in this picture, you'd probably say, a little girl, a cat in a tree. Maybe you've noticed that there are flowers. You might have even noticed they were foxgloves. I mean, you might notice some of the details, but probably not down to the level of how many stripes were on the cat's back. That's really what separates us average memory people from a person who has an eidetic imagery capability. Now, images are not pictures. So here we have two really classic ambiguous figures. And the one on the left is called the Necker cube. If you were like me, I didn't know the name of it in high school, but I doodled it on a lot of my high school notes. Took a lot of notes with Necker cubes, I now know. Because the fun thing about the Necker cube is that you draw the cube and it's three-dimensional, and which of the faces is projecting out towards you can switch, right? Sometimes it's one of the sides is coming towards you and other times it's the other side that's coming to you. That ability to see those three dimensions in what is a two-dimensional figure shows us that mental images are not neutral. They go beyond what's there. Your brain is recognizing that this looks like something out in the world that you've seen before. And so if I outline this front one, you can make this front panel be the one that's closer to you. And obviously it's see-through, right? Because you can see those lines extending backwards, even though they should have been blocked. Like this one should be blocked by the front panel. This one, if you keep it, this front one's a front panel, right? Keep it like that. This will be that inside line that you shouldn't be able to see because of the front panel and the top panel, right? So your brain is drawing inferences and it's saying, well, I think it's a cube. And then if you want to, you can switch. And now this front one becomes the front panel. And now this is the line you shouldn't be able to see because it's being blocked by the front panel. So your brain goes beyond the information that it has given, and it draws inferences based on what it's detecting. And that's the thing about mental images. They're not just strictly what's out in the world. Instead, you generate what's called percepts. Percepts are mental representations of the perceived stimulus. And so here we have this ambiguous figure on the right. As you look at it, your brain is automatically going to say what it thinks it is. And for some of you, the brain immediately said rabbit. For some of you, the brain immediately said duck. And that is part of how you're going to perceive this ambiguous shape going forward. And so you'll hold in your mind not necessarily this exact ambiguous form, you will hold in your mind a more rabbit like version of it or a more duck like version of it based on what your brain concluded it was. But it's not really there. Like it's just a line drawing that's ambiguous. Your brain is imposing the meaning on it. And that's the important thing with these kinds of ambiguous shapes. So imagine if you have something out in the world that you are perceiving, you can hold percepts in your mind, these mental representations that are maybe not exact perfect representations of the thing out in the world, right? You may be missing details. You may have added something because that suits your schema for that object out in the world, things like that. And so your images are not pictures. They include all of that perceptual stuff that we talked about in the previous chapters on perception. So that brings up the issue of long-term visual memory. How is visual information represented in long-term storage? So let's say that you went to this place, wherever it is, and you had this experience where you saw this tree reflected perfectly in the pond. This, I have to say, it looks like an AI generated thing. I don't know what it is. I pulled it off the internet. And then I just want to call your attention to the fact that the moon is over here. And so how would you remember this? How would your visualization of this be represented in long-term storage? Well, we think that images are stored in memory in a piece by piece fashion, that the details are each stored maybe in different nodes of your neural network or something like that. And in order for you to remember the details of that image, you have to activate the image frame, right? The basic outline. So now I want you to be thinking about that picture that was on the last slide and what factors would need to come into that image frame for you to start even beginning to populate that image. Like what memories do you need to pull out? What nodes do you have to activate to populate that image? It turns out that it takes longer to create images, to mentally create images that have more parts or more detail. And this picture here has 3 rows of dots, but it also has 4 columns of dots. If you ask participants to remember this picture of 3 rows of dots, it will take them less time to recreate this picture than if you ask them to remember this image of 4 columns of dots. I mean, clearly the number of dots doesn't change. There are 12 dots no matter which way you deal with it. But if you only have 3 rows to remember, that seems to be easier and faster than if you have 4 columns to remember. So if you take this very simple demonstration and expand it out to the real world, you can definitely imagine that the more details that are present, the way that the angle at which you perceive something, the way that you focus on it can determine how long it would take for you to generate an image of that picture, right? If you're looking at it from an angle where very few details are showing, it might be easier for you to remember it or to start describing it than if you're visualizing it from a really detail-laden side. So really interesting parts, right? So there's a difference between a mental image of 3 rows of dots and a mental image of 4 columns of dots. And the larger the number of units, the more complicated it's going to be for retrieval. So if you've told the participants to focus on 4 columns, that's what they're going to focus on, and it's going to feel like more to them than if you ask them to focus on 3 rows. And we do this, I think, probably in our everyday life. We probably look at real world experiences and automatically simplify or automatically make it more complicated based on what our motives are, what we're thinking about at the time, those kinds of things. So these little dots are just an example of like a larger issue in how imagery works. In general, imagery helps memory. In general, the use of imagery will improve memory. So researchers have shown, and actually I spent years of my graduate training studying this exact question. Um, and yeah, the easier it is to image a word, the easier it will be to remember that word. Words that are harder to imagine are going to be harder to recall. So here's a list of easy to imagine words, easy to image words: arrow, airplane, ball, banana, hatchet, box. And just to illustrate, I did research where some of the participants saw words and some saw these exact drawings. These are, I did not draw them, even though with my horrible art skills, I probably could have drawn these. These are called the Snodgrass and Vanderwart set of picture norms. And so some of the participants saw the pictures, some of them saw the words. And if they saw the words, half of those participants were told to visualize or imagine the words. So you were supposed to see the word arrow, but you were supposed to visualize an arrow. And then on the picture side, half of the participants were asked to label the object. So if you saw the picture of the arrow, you were supposed to think word arrow. And what I found is that people who were asked to visualize arrow and airplane and ball remembered the best. So by generating your own visual image, you benefited. The second best memory came from the people who saw the images and were asked to label the images. And then the next best performance came from the people who just saw the images and weren't given any instructions about labeling. And the worst performance was among the people who just saw the words. Now, this works really well for words that can be imagined. Words like ability, adoration, compassion, confidence, friendship, generation, these are not easily imagined. And so these words tend to be less readily remembered in these kind of experimental situations where we try and teach you a list of words. These are harder to remember than these concrete nouns that are, easy to imagine. Imagery mnemonics are helpful if the imagined objects are interacting in some way. So if you image an object and you imagine them interacting in some way, that actually boosts recollection. So remember back when I talked about like the peg word technique, and you had to imagine a bun interacting with whatever the word was that you were trying to remember, right? And that made it really memorable. Or the method of loci, right? Where you imagine the objects interacting, the object that you're trying to remember interacting with the environment in some fashion. That makes it a lot more memorable than if you just strictly image a word. Why is that? Why does imagery seem, especially the act of generating an image, really seem to benefit memory? Well, imagery improves memory under this thing called the dual coding hypothesis. Imagery improves memory by providing organization through dual coding. You have a picture code and you have a word code. And imageable materials can be coded verbally and as an image, and so that's going to give us multiple retrieval opportunities. So if we can have two codes, it makes it more likely that we can remember what we saw, or generally they're presented visually, sometimes auditorily. I've done some where I present it auditorily. So if you can imagine it, imageable materials, when it's time to recall them, you can either go look for the word that you have for that object, or you can remember the visualization that you created for that object. So you have like twice the chances of finding it in your memory, right? It just makes a ton of sense that imagery is going to help improve memory. So, memory for pictures. Why do we remember the picture of an arrow better than we remember the word arrow? Even in those conditions where the participants just saw the word arrow compared to people who just saw an arrow, we saw better performance among those who just saw an arrow. Well, the general principles of memory apply, right? Encoding specificity. Pictures might be more specific. they may have more detail than just the word, right? And so they naturally elicit deeper processing through that. It could be a function of your schemas or your generic knowledge about things, right? And so if the picture corresponds to your expectations, your schema, or the picture is consistent with your general knowledge of whatever it is that you're remembering, it's going to be more memorable. Spreading, activation, and priming. If you were already thinking about that thing, then you're already in the right part of the neural network and that part's already activated. It's going to be a lot easier to remember that material. And then finally, familiarity and source memory, right? If you are looking at a picture, it's going to probably feel a little bit more familiar than because it looks like something you've seen before, whereas words are just sort of they're not as familiar to us. I mean, clearly we can all read and we've all seen the words, but it doesn't feel like something that's part of us as much as a picture might. And also source memory. When you have pictures, you have the capability of sort of benefiting from feeling like the source might be close to you. You might be involved in this memory, that this image might be something that you personally have interacted with in the past. And so that kind of familiarity and source memory benefits us. Now, Friedman in 1979, he found that participants failed to notice differences between old pictures and new pictures if both were schema consistent. So he showed participants a list of pictures, and then he did a recognition task where some of the pictures were new and some of the pictures were from that original list of pictures. If the picture on the recognition test was one of the old pictures with something changed in it, so you should have said that's a new picture, it's got something different in it. If the change was schema consistent, participants didn't notice that it was a new picture. So for example, if you have a picture of a kitchen, and in the old picture, the stove was avocado green, and in the new picture, the stove is harvest yellow, harvest gold. I'm just using 1970s colors for some reason. They're both schema consistent. It's not enough of a change. People did not notice that that was a new picture. It's like, it's the same kitchen, it's fine. Whereas if it was originally a kitchen with an avocado green stove, and then in the new picture, it's a kitchen with, instead of a stove, it has a fireplace, that you notice. Now that's a change, right? So if it's consistent with your schema and it makes sense, you'll tend to go with it. Something else we've noticed about memory for pictures is a phenomenon called boundary extension. If you show a person a picture and then ask them to describe what was in the picture, they often remember the picture as having depicted more information than it really did. They draw logical inferences about what must be beyond the boundary of the picture. And so if they see a gate in the picture, they will remember having seen a fence, even though the picture ended at the gate. They'll remember there being a fence, because why would there be a gate if there's not a fence, right? They're drawing inferences based on how they know the world works. So they experience the picture as an observer who knows how the world works, and they don't rely strictly on what's in the picture. And so they draw inferences based on their expectations, their schematic knowledge of what, what should be in that picture, or what would be in a picture like that. And so it's something that I just really wish we could get more people to understand about what they see on TikTok and Instagram and stuff, is that, people expand out from those things beyond what was actually in the original source. And it causes us to draw inferences about what's going on. I think about times where there's a video that'll come out and it'll be showing something that we all get outraged about. I don't know, some kind of, theft ring or police brutality or something going on. And we don't get to see the beginning of it. We assume what must have happened beforehand. And that's an example of boundary extension. We think we understand how the world works well enough that we assume that our inferences make sense and are appropriate. And I would just like all of us to be aware that our inferences may be faulty. They may be incorrect given the stimuli. And so we need to be a little bit more skeptical than I think we are when we are exposed to things like videos and pictures. All right, well, that is my last thought on that. And I kind of went on to the general knowledge issue, but without any kind of outline, just kind of alluding to hopefully, after you've learned all these things about how people think, you will be more skeptical in the future about these kinds of stimuli. All right, well, that wraps up chapter 11. So I will see you next in chapter 12.